Well, thanks for the invite. It's good to be here today and to have a conversation about this. Just by way of introduction, I'm Daniel Zekveld. I work as a policy analyst for ARPA Canada. For anyone who's not aware of ARPA, it stands for the Association for Reformed Political Action. So it's a Christian nonprofit political advocacy organization, and our mission has two parts. So first, we try to help Christians across the country get engaged in politics to educate and encourage and equip them to do that. Um, Doing that in a variety of ways, writing about various political issues, giving updates, hosting events, doing presentations like this one, and then just giving tools that Canadians can use to be engaged with their elected representatives. And then the second part of our mission is to bring a biblical perspective to our civil authorities. So we engage in direct political advocacy, presentations at parliamentary committees, some government relations, lobbying, participating in court cases. We've also done a fair bit of writing for mainstream media and other media organizations trying to get the conversations about some of these issues into the public square as well. Yeah, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions throughout the presentation. Otherwise, I'll just keep going and we'll save some time for questions afterwards as well. Um, yeah, one of the issues that I focus on quite a bit in my work is this issue of euthanasia, also known as medical assistance in dying or MAID. Um, yeah, it's something that I've worked at ARPA for about 4 years now, and it's been a pretty active conversation politically in the past 4 years. So just participating, yeah, trying to write for the public, write for our network, trying to raise awareness and hopefully impact some change on this issue. I will share my screen here because I do have some slides to go along with this. Yeah, so I've been asked to speak on MAID, its impact, and the response of Christians. And I want to address the topic of euthanasia in Canada by focusing on three main points. So first, a quick overview of how euthanasia has expanded in Canada, and then we'll look at some of the impact that's had, especially on vulnerable Canadians, and then finally, how Christians should respond on this issue. So first, thinking about the background of euthanasia in Canada and its expansion. So in 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down Canada's prohibition on euthanasia and assisted suicide. So that's where you referenced the article from the National Post. It's just over 10 years since since that court case. That was early in February. So in 2016, then, Parliament passed Bill C-14, and that allowed euthanasia for people whose death is reasonably foreseeable. So that term reasonably foreseeable was not defined in the law, but generally it's the idea was that it means, people whose natural death is likely coming soon. So think, for example, of someone who has a terminal illness like cancer. And at the time, the argument was that euthanasia would only be a last resort. So when everything else has been tried, specifically like think stage 4 cancer, someone is likely to die soon. And there were some safeguards included in the law, but overall it was pretty vague and subjective. Then in 2019, a Quebec court struck down the prohibition for people whose death was not reasonably foreseeable. So the court there said that limiting it only to people who are dying should not be allowed. And the federal government could have challenged that decision since it was just a lower court in Quebec. They could have defended their law, but they chose instead to expand euthanasia further. So they expanded euthanasia again in 2021 to include people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. So that ultimately included people who are not nearing death but have a disability or chronic illness, something that will not cause their death, but something that causes various levels of suffering. The law also included a clause that would allow euthanasia for people with mental illness as their only condition. And that initially was set to begin in 2023, but the government delayed that until 2024. and then subsequently until 2027. So now it's scheduled for March 2027, just over 2 years from now. In between there was a bill, a private member's bill in Parliament trying to reverse that expansion, and that was narrowly defeated. It was quite close, but it was defeated. And then, as I mentioned, the mental illness piece is now delayed until 2027. There's a conversation right now in Parliament about whether to include something called advance requests, and that's to expand euthanasia ultimately to people with dementia or other capacity limiting illnesses. So a person who has dementia and is likely to lose capacity to consent at some point can consent in advance and say, when I reach this stage of my illness, then I want euthanasia without being able to give consent at the time. So that's a conversation. There's no law that's been introduced, but the federal government has started consultations and conversations on that piece as well. So that's a quick overview of the law around euthanasia in Canada. I want to look at some of the statistics on euthanasia as well. So the latest full year of statistics that we have is from 2023 from Health Canada. And in 2023, over 15,000 Canadians were killed by their doctors. Since 2016, all the way until 2023, that number is over 60,000. If you include 2024, that number would be over 75,000. And the rate of death by euthanasia is nearly 5% of all deaths in the country. So you see here the 4.7% of all deaths in the country in 2023. And that's a rate of death that's only exceeded by the Netherlands. Canada is the next highest in the world. And euthanasia is now the fifth most common cause of death in the country as well. So the number of deaths in Canada per year continues to increase rapidly. Here's a graph of the number of deaths between 2016 and 2023. The increase between 2022 and 2023 was 15.8%. So the previous few years were 30% increases or around 30%. So it's a smaller increase than those, but still a significant increase of over 2,000 more deaths in 2023 than in 2022. I mentioned that euthanasia has also expanded to people who are not dying. So those numbers are increasing as well. 4.1% of all euthanasia deaths are people who are not dying. So people with disabilities or chronic illnesses. That's also sometimes known as track 2 euthanasia, as opposed to track 1, which is for people who have a reasonably foreseeable natural death. One more statistic I want to highlight. I don't have a graph of it, but in 2023, there were just over 2,000 doctors who did euthanasia at least once in the country. But only 89 doctors were responsible for over 5,000 deaths. So that's an average of 60 deaths per doctor for that group. So some doctors in Canada are becoming experts, essentially, at euthanasia. And one doctor in particular has admitted to euthanizing over 400 patients. And that was already a couple years ago that she noted that fact. So those are some of the very concerning numbers in Canada. Canada now has one of the most permissive euthanasia regimes in the world. I appreciate that you mentioned the quote at the beginning that it's not a slippery slope, it's a cliff. Because at the beginning, when euthanasia was first introduced, the concerns were about a slippery slope. And those concerns and so much more have been realized in Canada in the past 10 years. So I want to move on from that and consider some of the impact that Maid has had on Canadians. And to do that, I want to start by looking at some of the reasons that people noted for why they requested euthanasia in 2023. Some of the reasons they stated for why they were suffering. And they can choose multiple reasons. They can click multiple boxes, but some of these factors in particular are telling. So the top three reasons are the loss of ability to engage in meaningful activities, the loss of ability to perform activities of daily living, and third, the loss of dignity. A lot of people will kind of think of severe pain when they think of euthanasia. That number is just over 50%, but it also includes fear of inadequate pain control. So it's not necessarily that even half of people listed inadequate pain of control as a reason for requesting euthanasia. But then these bottom two factors, I think, are especially telling. So nearly half of all Canadians who were euthanized in 2023 said that they felt like they were a burden on their family, friends, or caregivers. Um, Over 20% suffered from loneliness and isolation. When it comes to people who were not dying, that number was nearly 50%. So these are not medical conditions, they're social conditions. So imagine how these factors can contribute to a desire to die, but also how access to euthanasia can make someone feel like a burden because they're not accessing something that ultimately they think would not make them a burden anymore. So those are, some of the reasons people have requested euthanasia. Yeah, Glenn.
The issue of loneliness and isolation, how is that decided upon? I'm just trying to see how that could be as a medical decision or part of a medical decision.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so to clarify, these are um, when a person applies for euthanasia, they list a number of reasons why they're requesting euthanasia. So, um, effectively, something like loneliness and isolation can't get someone approved for euthanasia, but it's a factor that contributes to their desire to die, and maybe they have another illness or disease that qualifies them for euthanasia. But yeah, these are self-reported reasons.
Daniel,
Yeah.
if a person states that his primary reason is loneliness and isolation, would that qualify under the law for him to be a candidate for euthanasia?
If there's no other disability or illness, then it wouldn't. But this is where it gets complicated because someone might request it ultimately because they're lonely or isolated, but they also have a disability or an illness that qualifies them, right? So it's not the loneliness that qualifies them for euthanasia. It's the disease or the disability, but there's a lot of factors that go into someone's desire to die.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, one other way of kind of showing this complexity, um, the Office of the Chief Coroner in Ontario reviews troubling or suspicious deaths in the province. They have a review body that reviews certain Maid deaths in the province. And they found that some Ontarians are ultimately accessing Maid because of socioeconomic or psychological suffering. Um, again, typically they have another illness or disability that qualifies them, but then there's these other factors that are contributing to the problem. So they give some specific examples of cases where doctors failed to address suicidal ideation, substance abuse, inadequate housing, or other vulnerabilities like lack of connection to family when they wanted to be connected, those kinds of things. In one case, the coroner's review committee said that a woman who was approved for euthanasia likely actually only had mental illness as her only underlying condition. So that's something that's not even allowed yet until 2027. And the coroner's office actually found over 400 cases where doctors did not entirely follow the existing rules and safeguards. So, and there's actually very little penalty for doctors who do that as well. So, just very concerning in that sense as well that there's not enough oversight, not enough, even the existing rules we have are not necessarily being followed. So ultimately, instead of being seen as a last resort, euthanasia is now seen as a solution to many forms of suffering in Canada. We don't have any requirements in Canada to address mental illness, to address other forms of suffering that might be contributing, as long as a patient is eligible for euthanasia for whatever other reasons. Here's a few examples from the media over the past few years of people who have been offered Maid as a solution. So a woman in British Columbia went to the hospital looking for help because she was feeling suicidal, and someone mentioned Maid to her at the hospital. Very concerning, especially for someone in crisis. A woman in Nova Scotia, she was going into surgery for cancer, and she was asked if she had heard about euthanasia. So again, just something that's very she wasn't dying. She was just going into a surgery, and um, that gave her an increased fear of what's going to happen.
Oh,
Sorry, my there we go. Veterans have called the Ministry of Veterans Affairs and looking for help for PTSD or other supports for disabilities, and have been asked if they had heard about Maid. So again, some of this culture of maybe Maid is a solution to various forms of suffering. There was one elderly woman who was afraid of euthanasia and knew she didn't want to be euthanized, so she got a tattoo, "Don't euthanize me," so that it was very clear that she didn't want that in any medical circumstances. There's some organizations like here's an example, L'Arche Canada, who are very clear. We're not going to suggest, we're not going to refer you to medical assistance in dying as an alternative to supports. So they say you are important, you are valuable, your needs are important, you are safe here. And that's something that I think increasingly needs to be emphasized in a lot of places as euthanasia becomes so popular. But it's also something that a lot of, especially hospices and palliative care homes, are having difficulty doing now because governments are trying to force them to provide euthanasia on their premises, even Christian homes. And that's the central component of legal challenges right now in British Columbia and Quebec. So we'll see how those cases turn out. But Canadians are increasingly exposed to euthanasia, and it's increasingly difficult to find healthcare that won't offer or provide euthanasia and refuses to do so. So for the culture around us, euthanasia implies that certain lives are not worth living. Healthy or able-bodied people are considered worth helping. Maybe people with mental illness, we'll kind of see where that goes in the next couple years. But when a person has a disability or a disease, their lives are seen as not worth living. When a person is old and frail, likewise, their lives are seen as not worth living. And that not only puts pressure on Canadians to consider euthanasia, but it also disincentivizes our society from caring for the people who need help, ultimately devaluing the lives of people who are suffering. So that's some of the details of expansion, details of some of the impact that it's having on Canadians. So let's look a little bit at how we should respond as Christians. Of course, at times it can seem like euthanasia or assisted suicide is the compassionate thing to do. And that's kind of the argument that is often posed, especially when you have a situation where the rest of someone's life might be filled with pain and suffering. And those are awful situations. So, but as Christians, we know that suffering is real on this earth. Pain, disease, disability, mental illness, they all point to the effects of sin on our world and the need for the world to be renewed. In Romans 8, Paul speaks to the question of human suffering. He says this, quote, For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. Not only that, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. So just an example of when Christians are face to face with sufferings, we look forward to everlasting life. But euthanasia is not the answer to suffering. We also know that suffering builds us up in ways that we can't necessarily see. So in James 1, verse 12, we read, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him." So we might not know the purpose of suffering in the moment, but we can respond to suffering by remaining faithful and ultimately giving glory to God. At the same time, suffering is an opportunity for care. I don't know if any of you have heard of Stephanie Gray Connors, but she wrote a book called Start With What? And there she writes this: "When suffering occurs and we cannot understand how a good God would not intervene in the way we would, we can remind ourselves of the following. We don't see the full picture. We are creature and not creator. And third, faith is trusting in the goodness of God even when our present circumstances leave our minds bewildered." And instead of questioning why we experience suffering, we can ask what we can do in light of the situation and how we can use it for good. Stephanie Gray Connors also notes that every person in some way is suffering. And with that reality comes all kinds of opportunities to unleash love. So suffering allows us to care for each other, to be cared for. And it's a reminder that we're not in control of our own lives, but we rely on God and we rely also on those around us. I also want to note a little bit about human dignity. The third most commonly cited reason for suffering, which I mentioned earlier, was the loss of dignity at nearly 65% of people who were euthanized in 2023. And loss of dignity or this idea of a loss of ability can be a real fear for Christians as well, for anyone who is suffering from disease or illness. You can think of so many different diseases that can really devastate bodies and make people almost entirely reliant on others. But as our culture has embraced death for those who are suffering, there's this idea that dying with dignity, or so-called dying with dignity, has come to mean being killed before one becomes too disabled or too dependent on other people. But we know that dignity is not ultimately found in our ability, in our health, or in our disposition. Every person has dignity just by the fact that we're made in the image of God. Professor Richard Weikart, he wrote a book called Unnatural Death, and in that book he writes this: "Offering people an easy way to end their lives does not let them die with dignity. Superficially, it may seem compassionate to some. However, in reality, it tells them they are no longer worth helping, that they are nothing but the sum of their aches and pains, their fears, and their despair." So Canada's initial euthanasia law is based on this arbitrary idea that some human beings have dignity and some do not. Some lives are worth living and some do not. But the growth of euthanasia since 2016 has demonstrated the serious problems with that approach, ultimately adding more and more people to this category of life that is not worth living. So what's the response of Christians to this? We read in Proverbs 24, verse 11 and 12, of how Christians can confront euthanasia as well. In that passage, we're called to, as it says there, rescue those who are being taken away to death, hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. If you say, "Behold, we did not know this," does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? So we're called to rescue those who are considering or being encouraged to end their lives. And Christians ought to do this by helping care for those who are suffering. Underlying every desire to die is ultimately a request for help. One woman who was euthanized in 2021 wrote this before her death: I think if more people cared about me, I might be able to handle the suffering caused by my physical illnesses alone. Many today suffer without a church community, perhaps without a caring family, perhaps without many friends. But the church has a responsibility then to care for those who are suffering and to emphasize the dignity of human life in all circumstances, to care for our neighbors at a very personal level. And we can show our neighbors what this means. An example of this, there was a man in St. Catharines, Ontario, who was approved for euthanasia a couple years ago. And he was deemed eligible because of chronic back pain. That was his disability. But he was also at threat of becoming homeless. And that was what he said was ultimately driving his request. He did not want to become homeless. And his community found out that he was going to access euthanasia. And when they found out, they gathered support and raised funds to help him pay his bills. As a result of that, he withdrew his request for euthanasia because of the care and support he had received from his community. Maybe some of us can think of personal examples where family members were suffering or dying and were able to receive help and care so that they lived well despite their pain and suffering. Whether it's financial support, improved palliative care support, improved pain relief, other types of support, suffering can be alleviated. Not necessarily eliminated, but at least alleviated with the help and care of the community. Thinking back to all the people who request euthanasia because of loneliness or because they think they're a burden. Each of us can help anyone in our network know that they are cared for, that they're not a burden, and help them to not feel lonely. That speaks also to the importance of something like hospice care or palliative care for those who are dying or suffering in other ways. Giving care even to those who are beyond physical cure can help relieve their suffering. Dr. Cicely Saunders is considered the worldwide founder of palliative care, and she was the founder of St. Christopher's Hospice in London. She said this, "You matter because you are you. You matter to the last moment of your life, and we will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but to live until you die." This is really the motto for palliative care. It's possible to die with dignity or to die peacefully without killing the patient. So that really relates to caring for those around us at the personal level. Christians can also be involved at the political level. We can't pretend that euthanasia is not legal in our country or ignore some of the calls for further expansion to euthanasia. We can speak out when a government says that some lives are not worth living, and continue to promote life-affirming care for everyone. But how do we do that practically? So ARPA Canada has a campaign on euthanasia called Care Not Kill, and I use that as an example. The website is available at carenotkill.ca. If anyone is interested in looking at that, there's some talking points on there, some arguments, and some specific things that you can do to help make a difference. And through that campaign, we aim to equip Christians to engage with the public and with elected representatives on the issue of euthanasia. Now, ARPA Canada believes that euthanasia should never be a solution for suffering at any stage of life or illness. But right now, this campaign is focused on a little bit narrower, primarily really focused on advocating for the government to begin reversing some of the expansion we've seen in recent years, particularly focusing on people who are not dying, in the hopes that once that happens, if that is reversed, then we can also begin to see more protection for people who are dying as well. Here's a few particular examples that we use of what everyday Canadians can do about it. So certainly emailing your MP. We have an email system with some pre-written text as well that helps prepare an email and is easy to send off to your member of parliament. Second, write a letter to the editor. Always a valuable way to raise awareness in a local community newspaper and see what kind of response you get. The third one's a little more difficult and costly. We've seen some communities run bus ads to raise awareness and to, euthanasia is one of those things that I think a lot of people in our communities don't necessarily know how far it has gone. They have an idea of what it is, and what they think about it, but they don't necessarily know how far it has gone and are concerned certainly when they hear how far it has gone. And then finally, collect signatures on a petition. So we do have a petition campaign going right now. Um, the petitions are on the website as well. And yeah, we're getting a bunch of churches, a bunch of individuals to sign the petition, and we have some members of parliament who are willing to introduce it in the House of Commons once we give them um, as big a stack as we can of petitions. So just another way to bring the issue to the forefront, to bring it up in conversation in the House of Commons as well. And of course, the easiest thing and in many ways the most practical thing we can do is continue to pray for the protection of Canadians, to pray that our society, that Christians and others in our society will care for those who are suffering rather than supporting them to end their lives. So with that, that's all I've got for the kind of formal presentation, but happy to open it up for any questions and comments as well.
I want to thank Daniel for the opening of the discussion and would welcome any questions for Daniel. Either you can just speak yourself, which is probably better, or just post it in the chat, and we can then ask Daniel to share some answers with us. Just as a question, Daniel, do we have any idea how many Christians or people who identify as Christian have accepted euthanasia or Maid?
I don't. No. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not aware of any surveys or anything that have been done among Christians particularly.
Jennifer posted here, you mentioned doctors who don't follow instructions and implement euthanasia. Can you give some examples or say more about that?
Yeah, so there's yeah, like I said, the Ontario coroner has kind of a system in place where they yeah, it's supposed to be an oversight system, ensuring that doctors do follow these existing safeguards and rules. Um, Typically, they'll just respond to a doctor, send them an email, kind of say, "Don't do this again." Depending on the level of severity, in theory, they could report situations to law enforcement as well, that kind of thing, which has not happened yet. One of the safeguards that they've seen ignored a number of times is, so for people who are not dying, there's a 90-day waiting period, um, just to try to get them some supports, try to see if they'll change their minds about wanting euthanasia. And some doctors have ignored that 90-day waiting period and euthanized a patient earlier than the 90 days. Um, there's a couple requirements around witnesses, that kind of thing, which have been, yeah, not always followed. Um, yeah, there's this some of the specific examples. There's not a lot of very specific scenarios shared about that because most of that is not public information. Although the number of doctors is public, but the yeah, not the all the specific scenarios. There was one situation where a doctor um, gave the uh, wrong, what do you call it? The wrong dosage, or the wrong medication is the wrong word because medicine is different than ending someone's life. But for lack of a better word, medication, and someone was left dying for hours, really. So there are some instances where yeah, it's definitely very concerning. And then others where it's, yeah, always concerning if they don't follow the safeguards, but there are some, yeah.
Daniel?
Daniel, has there been any projections of that extrapolate what this means, especially as we face the growing aging population. Um, for example, for those who don't know, allow me, Glenn, maybe I should reference the report from the Lausanne conference, which happened just in South Korea about a few months ago. And we have on the call here Tom McCormick, who's been involved in that. And the expected uh, growth of aging population is going to outstrip all our expectations. What does this mean to this whole area? It's funny. I remember, and again, 20 more than 20 years ago, one of my clients was one of the largest hospitals in Toronto here. And in a meeting, we were talking about the aging population and the stretch on the healthcare system. And that was 20 years ago. And he said, euthanasia will help us with this problem. And that was a vice president of one of the largest hospitals in the Toronto area. So is this, as we look at the aging population, what does this mean to the expected growth of the euthanasia business? And I call it a business, really.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think we're seeing that already with the rapid growth of euthanasia deaths in the country. I think there were some people early on that said, "Oh, it will kind of plateau, numbers will decrease because there's multiple people who want it right now, but it's not going to, become extremely popular." But we have seen that it has become very popular among um, yeah, among Canadians kind of in general, but also along certain segments of the medical profession as well. Um, I think you're right that when people are aging and in need of a lot of care, it is a very costly thing on the healthcare system. And um, yeah, my hope is that most people, even if they support euthanasia, don't do so because of the cost, but that but I think there are some who see it as cost saving as well. And yeah, going back to that idea that it just creates this culture that certain lives are not worth living. And as we do that, then yeah, like you say, a growing aging population that becomes a bigger and bigger group of people as well.
The one is if you had a friend seriously considering Maid due to profound childhood abuse, how would you engage with this friend, a Christian, a reformed Christian, in fact? Life is so unbearable. He can only want a way out. Churches have been unwilling to respond out of their depth, having nothing to say. Any advice?
That's a very difficult question. Um, yeah, some of these very personal, very specific scenarios are difficult, certainly. There's yeah, as I said, we know that suffering is real. There's I mean you mentioned due to profound childhood abuse, and that's something that um actually doesn't make someone eligible for euthanasia in Canada, but contributes to certainly contributes to a request. Um yeah, in many ways I'm not really qualified to answer this question. It's something that, we focus primarily on the policy side of things and um, yeah, awareness and that kind of thing. That said, I think it's yeah, a lot of trying to just come alongside somebody and care for them and be there for them. On the flip side, I do think the law has a factor on that as well. So if the law is changed, then someone will not be so quick to want or to desire euthanasia. I mean, we know that feeling suicidal is also a reality for many people. And I think the problem comes when the government says suicide is okay, rather than supporting suicide prevention in any circumstance. Um, I see you followed up there where to go for pastoral advice and experience in these situations. Yeah, I mean, certainly the church, but you said churches have been unable or unwilling to respond as well. I think there are some organizations. I'll have to look into it. I think I'm trying to think of one organization in particular that does try to help with some of these conversations about euthanasia in particular, but I might have to get back to you on that one because I can't think of it right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think everyone would appreciate if somebody did, well, if you could get back in terms of, how or who we can refer people to. I think just going back, sort of, before I get on to George's comment, just going back to what Thomas said there, churches have been unable or unwilling to respond. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, obviously, as you're trying to advocate, what has been the response of the churches as a whole?
Yeah, good question. I mean, yeah, the churches as a whole is kind of a very can be a very broad category in Canada. Our organization primarily works with Reformed churches in Canada, um, and yeah, they have been pretty quick to respond to the political aspects of it, certainly. Um, I think it becomes more difficult as more people have personal experience with euthanasia. Um, yeah, when there are more of these kind of pastoral, personal situations that they have to deal with. But I think as a whole, the church at least yeah, churches I'm more familiar with are especially quick to respond to things like euthanasia for mental illness or even for disability, and then it becomes a little more difficult in cases where people are nearing death, because then they have yeah maybe a little bit more personal experience with pain and those kinds of things. So where and we see that reflected in Canadian surveys broadly as well, that people are much more supportive of euthanasia at the end of life, and as it expands further, they become less and less supportive as a whole.
Thanks, Daniel. Just another question then. In your opinion, is there ever a good case for euthanasia? For example, someone who is no longer able to eat and is dying, but can be relieved from suffering for the last few days of expected life.
Um, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think doctors should ever end their patients' lives. That's contrary to what healthcare is. Um, yeah, again, recognizing that it's a very difficult circumstance, a very difficult situation, but yeah, and I guess I would distinguish too between, there are cases where um, people are trying to make someone live on and on rather than allowing God to take them. So I think there is an element of, yeah, if someone is unable to eat or drink, it's like you're not going to try to prolong their life in a way that is not, um, yeah, is not going to work. Like God is going to take them at some point, um, rather than, yeah, rather than actively ending their life.
Daniel, I clicked on the link for the petition and it sent it to be a form, a paper form. Do you guys intend to make this into an electronic online submission?
Yeah, so we actually only have a paper petition. Um, the reason for that is because the MPs that we talked to believe that for this, it's a little bit more effective if we get paper petitions and then they can distribute them um, among multiple MPs to introduce in the House of Commons.
Yes.
Um, if you do fill out on the paper petition, you can either try to send it directly to your MP and see if they will introduce it, or you can send it to us as well, and we'll add it to our stack of petitions that we'll be giving to MPs as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. Um, any questions from others who have not asked a question yet? I'm sure Daniel would love to hear more or explain, speak more. Um, Daniel, just on the direct or directed, I think it was called directed euthanasia, the newest one that they're hoping to introduce. Would that just apply to those who are uh, sort of looking towards future euthanasia?
Yeah, so like the advanced requests or advanced directives, um, yeah, it's mainly for people who have a capacity limiting illness. So they will at some point lose capacity to consent. And it's a way for them to say, I want euthanasia when I reach this point in my illness. And then they can be euthanized without consent at that point. Um, yeah, because ultimately, people with dementia can get euthanasia already, but only if they can consent immediately before they die.
Just working from that, then there's a distinct possibility that going forward, anybody could give sort of a direct or point for or what is it? You spoke about a directive,
Yeah,
because at some point, I think a lot of us will not, you know, have the mental capacity, and so you could do something that could be like just a directive that you could include in your will, that if this was to happen, then I wish to be euthanized. Is there any talk or thought along that line?
Um, yeah, I think there's some people that would advocate for that. That's not what the current consultation is about. The current consultation is more narrow than that, certainly. There are some people who are having conversations about that. And I mean, in some ways, there's a lot of different pieces of expansion that are being talked about. Whether those come to reality or how long that takes is another question.
Another question is euthanasia an unforgivable sin?
That's another good question. Um, I mean, yeah, you have the same question about whether suicide is an unforgivable sin, right? And I would uh, generally equate euthanasia with suicide. Um, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I think that's a very complex theological question, which yeah, there would be some, need maybe a lot of digging to answer that fully.
Yeah, I think combined with that is the question is, um, in the eyes of God, would the doctors themselves be considered as murderers? Don't have, well, yeah, I think they would. Uh, Question for you too from Jennifer. Daniel, what are your views on passive euthanasia?
Yeah, so passive euthanasia, as in, for example, withdrawing life support or yeah, allowing someone to die when it is their time to die. Um, I yeah, it's a again a complex kind of end of life scenario. Um, and yeah, the goal of medicine is um to care for people, to help them to live. The goal of palliative care to help them to die well, ultimately. Um, but that doesn't mean prolonging their life beyond trying to keep God from taking them. Um, it's a bit of what I mentioned earlier. Um, yeah, passive euthanasia. If yeah, I wouldn't prefer to call it euthanasia. Um, I would call it, yeah, I guess ultimately it's someone dies. And that's because of natural processes and God takes them, as opposed to um, yeah, actively ending someone's life, which I would call euthanasia.
Mhm. Thank you. Any other questions? Another one here. Oh, just the comment, quite a few scenarios where life support has been withdrawn, but the person lives quite a while still.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. And that's yeah, so something like withdrawing life support is a difficult conversation for for family members and doctors to have. Um, yeah, but at some point it is leaving it in the hands of God, and God may allow the person to live longer without life support as well.
Oh, Tom just also then said putting such matters on POA documents is recommended. Um, I think which is a very good point because I think it takes away the sting of making that decision at the end of the day, on how it's going. Just from a political point of view, then, Daniel, within the House of Assembly, what is the sort of the breakdown, not exact, but the feeling of the MPs themselves and within the Senate?
Yeah, so on euthanasia for mental illness, I'm hopeful that that will never come into effect, or at least not in the near future. Um, the Senate did introduce that clause into the bill, so the Senate was pretty supportive of it. There's a lot of MPs who are concerned about it. So even though the private members bill that I mentioned was narrowly defeated, it did seem like there were enough MPs that could have passed it. Um, but then it was delayed anyways. So I think if and when it comes up again in 2 years, I think there will still be a lot of concern about that piece. Um, I think there's quite a few who are concerned about where euthanasia is at already as well. I'm not sure if it's a majority of the MPs. Um, yeah, I know. Yeah, I can say I think fairly about mental illness that probably a majority of MPs are at least have pretty serious reservations about that. Beyond that, quite a few varying opinions.
Um, I think you've already covered the topic, but um, is addiction um, a reason for euthanasia, like drug addiction or something like that?
Not currently. Um, if yeah, there's questions about whether it would be if made for mental illness were allowed. Um, It's not currently, although it is, yeah, sometimes a factor. Um, Whether that's, addiction causes other physical issues, or whether that's addiction alongside of another illness that makes someone eligible.
Right, right. Well, I'm just thinking of the sort of the opportunities, if you like, for the Maid implications or that you could put in place. I mean, you could really wipe out a population just by implementing a couple of these decisions. Um, Huge implications. Super. Daniel, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your knowledge and wisdom. We appreciate it. I hope that we will still have further discussions. Um, I see Christine has added that herself. She said, appreciate this conversation. I was able to tune into for perspective and prayer and action steps. God bless you. And I think from all of us, God bless you and thank you. And may He strengthen you and ARPA in the work that you are doing and that you might make a huge impact on the Canadian scene.